the New World Order.
Yeah.
So,
and their use of technology today.
Yes. So this question then, you see, of the role of technology. So what is that role of technology? Where is the human being in technology, for example? How do we make a personal relationship to technology? I found, for example, in Japan that the Japanese have, from their Shintoist point of view, all the elements are divine: metal, water, wood. Everything is divine, and therefore nothing is to be feared. And so for them, they will say, "Why are you Westerners so afraid of robots?" You see,
yeah, right.
We Japanese are not afraid of robots. We quite happily make them. You see,
right.
But I felt quite early on from my time in Japan, and that feeling was only increased as I went on. Yeah, that actually the people of East Asia do not, in their development of technology, they have not. I feel that there is something which they are not perceiving within the world of technology. And the world of technology is a world, particularly since the development of electricity, and maybe you could say more about that later, which I feel that they are not seeing what the essence of that is. And it represents something which the Westerners feel is how can I put this? There is a sinister aspect. There is a dangerous aspect to it. Yeah. And that element has gone right through Western culture since Mary Shelley and Frankenstein,
yes.
As many people have pointed out. But there is a sense in the West in which we are aware of this, how can I put it? Not ghost in the machine, but demon in the machine, so to speak.
Yes.
And how to work with that, right? Now, that comes to quite profound questions, and if I just go back a minute to the church, because again, it's not a clear-cut black-white issue why the church cut the West off from spiritual research in that early period. Steiner points out that before the church really turned rotten, so to speak, which was around about the 12th, 13th century, as an institution, you could always find pretty bad popes before that, but as individuals.
Right.
But as an institution, Steiner points out that really the church had nothing more to do in European culture after the 13th century. That the church functioned within European culture as a kind of wet nurse, as a kind of civilizing force for the barbarian tribes from my part of the world and yours, from Scandinavia, from northern Germany, the so-called Germanic peoples, right, who attacked and then overwhelmed the Roman Empire. And the church fulfilled the function of somehow carrying on some of, obviously not all, the gifts and the treasures of the pre-Christian civilization, from the Greek times, from even some of the Gnostic things, that these were carried on through the church, and also, of course, the institutional questions, the whole concept of law and all the rest of it. Yeah. That was one of the functions of the church, and that was justified, so to speak. That the Germanic tribes had lots of energy, but there was a sense in which they themselves wanted to be civilized, and they were in effect civilized, in inverted commas, by the institution of the church from about 400 until 1200. But after that time, this new European humanity, you could say, post-Roman, had come into a new stage of its development, which I could mention later. And then from that time on, the church turns really, really bad. And that's when we start to see things like the crusade against the Cathars. We see the development of the Inquisition, and so on. Yeah. But I just mean that before that time, in this time of which I was speaking about, the 5th to the 9th centuries, it was not necessarily all, that everything that the church did was bad. And Steiner points out that there were individuals, and it's always a question of individuals here,
of course,
that there were individuals in the 9th century who could see, who had, as it were, a certain kind of clairvoyance, a certain kind of farsightedness, and they could see that something would need to come into European development in the future, and that which needed to come into European development was materialism. And that technology and technical science would need to be developed in the West. And for that purpose, the West needed to be cut off from the Eastern Orthodox stream, the stream of Byzantium, which contained all of these contacts with Asia, do you see?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this is what happened. This is what happened in the Council of 869. This is why Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, was anathematized. And this is where the beginning of the split took place, Henrik, in the year 869, in the 9th century, between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And that was then came to conclusion with the so-called Great Split, or the Schism of the Church in 1054, where the two churches anathematized each other, Constantinople and Rome,
mm-hmm.
and then they stopped talking to each other, they excommunicated each other, and that goes on still today.
Yes.
They still have not formally forgiven each other, do you see? They're
well,
trying
they are getting closer, yeah, they are. I mean, there have been deals here and there, but I get your point.
That's right. But the reason for this was that there was a certain amount of, as I would call it, initiate knowledge, even within the Roman Church at that time, that Europe had to go down this dark path for a time, that materialism would have to come into European culture for a time, and that therefore a certain door would have to be shut off, do you see?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is quite a profound thing if you think about it in the whole context of European development, yeah?
Indeed.
And it's not just, you see, it's not just a case, as one sometimes hears in alternative circles, of, right from the year dot, everything about the church and all its works was negative, and they enslaved humanity, and it's been horrendous from that time until this. The human being in the West has gone through certain changes, through certain stages of development, and the church accompanied it up to a point, and then came a point where the church's role was over, and then of course comes the usual problem that those people whose role is over don't recognize that, don't want to recognize that, and then try to hang on to power.
Right. Well, I see what you mean. Do you think then that this is in some way divinely guided, these things, or are these philosophies by men still that consider, okay, this must take place at this particular time for the human race to develop into these two different strands, if you know what I mean?
Well, perhaps we could say that there's a sense in which I would say, Hendrik, that the Christian church had to go through its own. The essence of Christianity is crucifixion and resurrection, and that means that the Christian religion has to go through its own crucifixion and resurrection, and that's what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
That is exactly what's happened and what's happening. So we have seen, and we are seeing still today, the church, particularly since the Protestant split. But we see the Catholic Church has betrayed Christ, just like Peter betrayed Christ. And we've seen the Catholic Church under attack. And we're seeing all of the churches. We're seeing churchianity, if you will, under attack. Yeah.
Mm.
But those people who would wish to kill churchianity, I would say they would be making a big mistake if they're thinking they're also killing Christianity. Because in a sense, the real Christianity lives within the hearts and spirits and souls of individuals,
right.
And that is what is actually happening now. That has been happening in the modern world. That people are now coming to their own. They're feeling very carefully forward to their own experience of what Christianity is, who Christ was, and of its relationship and Christ's relationship to all of the spiritual streams within world history.
Mm.
So, the end of the age of churches, yes, but not the end of the ages of what I would call of what Christ was about. And so, if you ask, is this in some way divinely guided? Then in the sense that the church has to go through its own crucifixion as its own resurrection, I would say that is profoundly spiritually or divinely guided. Yes,
it's a very, very interesting perspective to look at things, because again, I like this idea that you don't look at it as black and white as this. There's always, the yin and yang in everything, as you described before. And even if we look at the question of the Middle East and as the kind of the gateway to the East, do you think that this has also been an important area because of its, the importance here have been to control this area in order to keep the two sides separated? That's why they sent, the Templars down there, and that's why even to this day, perhaps then, that we're seeing this area as being, there's a lot of violence in the area. They're trying to keep people, in one sense, away from there, if you know what I mean, in order to have the two sides separated. Do you think that could be the case as well?
Steiner pointed out in the First World War, he said that the two sides that were fighting in the First World War, although it was horrendous, that there was a certain sense in which this idea of the Entente powers fighting the central powers of Europe, this is an illusion. And that what's actually going on was in a completely other place. The real struggle was going on in a completely other place. And I would say something similar is happening now. That when we are told about the war on terror, and that this is based in Islamist terrorism, I was hearing Tony Blair talking about that on the radio just today, that the West is fighting, in a sense, a struggle against radical or fundamentalist Islam, then this is a complete illusion. I would say this struggle is totally illusory, and the real struggle is somewhere else. It's at a deeper spiritual level. Perhaps we could come to that later. But
yes.
I just point out that it's very interesting that when we think that really there are three great world faiths or world religions in the world, there's Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. And and when I say three, I mean very large ones,
Sure.
Which are you could say cosmopolitan. They are not specific to one particular culture in the way, for example, say that Hinduism is,
yes.
or even arguably that Judaism is, But that these three are cosmopolitan. And one sees, for example, that 600 years before Christ, approximately around that time, there is some dispute amongst historians when exactly it was, but let's say from that time on, somewhere between 600 and 480, we see the stream of Buddhism coming out of India. And then 570, we seem fairly clear. 570 after Christ, approximately 600, we see Muhammad born. So on either side of Christ, you have one of these streams emerging in India, and then the other stream emerging in Saudi Arabia, in Arabia, the Islamic stream. So you've got Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. And one can ask oneself, well, what is actually the relationship between these three streams? And Steiner pointed out, well, we see an interesting development that 600 years after Christ, Islam appears as a kind of re-emergence of that which was in the Middle East 600 years before Christ. In the Middle East, I'm thinking of Babylonians, Chaldeans, and Jews. At that time, the Jews returned from Babylon from the second 538 from the second captivity and started building the temple. And that's the 6th century. So that whole stream of Judaism, and then we start getting the whole Jewish Bible is written after that time, And from that time, we then see that there's a kind of recrudescence, a re-emergence of that moon religion, which Steiner characterizes it. The religion of the Near East re-emerges in a new form, but very similar in some respects, in Islam, 600 years after Christ. So there's a kind of a balance here, do you see, within history, And then he says, well, look what happens then, 600 years later. From 600 years after Christ to the Crusades, 1200, you see the Christian world and the Islamic world in conflict with each other. But that conflict, but it's a bit like, Henrik, teenagers fighting. When teenagers fight,